Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. I think that if you ate somewhere between 8 and 10 of those little fish and chip baskets, you probably had a full plate of fish and chips. So don't let anyone shame you if you did that, because I'm certainly not going to. First panel of this afternoon is discussing the investment and the funding outlook for science and technology. So we're going to delve into where the most attractive opportunities are at the moment in the UK, what the funding market looks like within this country when we compare it with other international destinations, and how we can use this to fast-track UK innovation. I've got a great trio of guests to work through this with me. I'll let them introduce themselves in just a moment, but just a reminder that you can use Slido to ask them questions during the panel, and we'll get the microphones out to you all as well. As I say, I'll ask our guests to introduce themselves and just briefly give us a snapshot of their role, their business, and the lens that they're looking at these topics through. Glenn, if I can start with you, and then we'll work.
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is Glenn Crocker. I'm one of the executive directors and co-owners of Pioneer Group, which was formed just over 2 years ago following the acquisition of BioCity by Trinity Investment Management. Pioneer Group does three things based on the model that was developed at BioCity, which is we develop and operate largely life science real estate, but we operate in the human and planetary health space. We've got a portfolio of about £1 billion worth of real estate, and there are 12, soon to be 14 sites across the UK and also in Ireland. In Dublin, we've got a site. The second thing that we do is we have a venture building team working with universities and Innovate UK and other organisations like that to create and develop early stage life science companies. And thirdly, we make investments into those companies, either companies that we've been involved in creating and developing in the first place, or companies that are based on our sites across the UK, mostly at the sort of pre-seed and seed stage of investment.
Perfect. Thank you, Glenn. Rebecca, over to you.
And I'm Rebecca Todd. I work for Longwall Ventures, and we're a venture capital fund. We're very sort of classic 10-year life cycle funds, and we invest in a whole range of early stage science and technology. When we say early stage, we've been known to back an entrepreneur with a patent and a great market opportunity. So really early by the concepts of the market, and we work with them to become their sort of financial partner through the early development stages. And that means working pretty closely. I'm talking to the CEOs of businesses in my portfolio, once or twice or even more a week at important junctures. And we've been doing this for about 15 years now. And we're very, very small and lean. And so I'm looking at this topic, if you like, from the perspective of people building businesses and starting those businesses with innovative technology. A lot of our portfolio companies are university spin-outs, not all of them. And we invest across the UK, so we have a kind of a breadth of view, and we're looking at I'm looking at this space from the building businesses, securing further finance, getting from the seed, the beginning, through to ultimately scale up, and then for investors looking for a change in ownership so that we get an exit.
Perfect. And Hitesh?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hitesh Thakra. I spent most of my career in investing and in innovation, most of it in public markets, running technology and life science funds. I now do a number of things in venture and startups. So I'm a single partner at Syncona, which is a cell and gene therapy largely fund based, which was funded by the Wellcome Trust. I sit on the board of the Turing Institute for AI, and I'm a council member at STFC, which is looking at the physical sciences in Harwell and looking at early stage companies in the physical sciences as well as the life sciences.
Perfect. Let's start the conversation with this idea of revaluation that you have in the title of the panel. I'd love to get your thoughts on how the macro events of recent months have impacted the funding and the investment markets. And Glenn, I know you've come ready armed with some investment stats. So maybe if we could start with those,
Yeah.
then Hitesh and Rebecca could just see if that chimes with what they're seeing at the moment.
Sure. I mean, I thought I would look at some hard figures for investment in life sciences over recent months, over the last 12 months actually, because for people that haven't necessarily been involved in the sector for a long period of time, particularly those that have come into it on the real estate side in the last 2 or 3 years and seen 2021 boom year of investment, if they think that that's normal, then it most certainly wasn't. And 2021 was a huge blip. If you look at the average amount of investment, the number of deals that's been done in the last 12 months, it's about the same as the 4 years prior to 2021. So it pretty much just got back to where we were before. In fact, it's a bit better over the last 12 months. So I think the industry is actually in a pretty robust position. There will be issues from the macroeconomic challenges, increases in interest rates, obviously change people's investment strategies. But overall, my key point I want to make is things aren't quite as dire as people say they are.
Rebecca, similarly
Well, actually, I was
optimistic?
Hitesh, I know, has got some public market stats, haven't you? So
Yeah.
why don't we...
Yeah, and so the public markets have been, up until about 21, I think we had the best year in biotech investing just after COVID when interest rates were cut. And since then it's been very poor, if truth be told. We've had the XBI index, which is a biotech index for startups and small companies, languishing around 80, 85. What we have seen in public markets is a rise in M&A. So in the last 12 months, if I told you there's been 1,000 deals in healthcare, most of those almost all of them in M&A. So there's activity going, and that's, of course, what you find. You never get the IPO cycle and the M&A cycles coinciding. You normally get, at the end of the cycle, M&A coming in because pharma companies are very careful with their money, and now they're buying. So we had Seattle Genetics, or Seagen, $44 billion, the biggest ever biotech purchase about 6-9 months ago. We had a cash deal 2 weeks ago from Lilly. So there's a lot of activity going below the line in the M&A world. And what we haven't seen yet is M&A, the IPO market. And the reason for that is very simple. Everyone obviously knows about the inflation story. The discount rate, of course, is the thing that drives returns. And if your discount rate is going from 1 to 6, probably closer to 10 in biotech, all your long duration assets are going to be worth a lot less. So until we get some starting of the rate cuts, the IPO cycle will not happen. What I would say is that financial markets mean revert. So we will find a point where they'll discount what's coming ahead. We're not there yet. And it takes about 8 months before. So about 8-10 months before, markets will bottom before we see the rate cuts or the recession over and markets recovering. So it is trying to anticipate it, but we're not there yet.
And I think what I'm seeing is that we've got the restructuring of the financial system, if you like, going on now, but we've also got a kind of post-COVID dynamic, especially in life sciences, where 2021 was fueled largely by everybody kind of waking up and thinking, oh, healthcare, life sciences, it's very important, it's a big space, and money poured in 2021. And people talk about tourist investors, don't they? That's one of the terms that people do talk about, because it suddenly became the vogue place to be investing. And those parties are leaving the scene again. I have to say, for those of us who have been around for a little while, I couldn't understand what was happening in 2021. Some of the valuations that were put on businesses, some of the exuberance, the craziness was, it's clearly a bubble. And we are correcting from that. But underneath that is an incredible life science sector, particularly, and the science sector in the UK broadly. And the discoveries we've got is just absolutely buoyant, and there is investment coming into the UK into that area because it is such good science base, and we are leading on so many aspects of cutting edge science, and the life science sector is just so exciting. I mean, we're changing medicine. overnight. We're living in an absolute revolution in medicine. You can cure cancers that were never curable now broadly. I mean, people kind of won't use the word cure because you have to wait and see about remission rates. But the cell therapies that are coming through and they're just completely different ways of doing medicine. And so it's rightly an exciting space. But within that, we had this kind of crazy 2021 that happened. But that's the broader picture from where I'm sitting.
Tactically, what's happening in the market is that you're seeing late-stage assets. If you've got a late-stage asset, you are getting funding. And I've seen late-stage assets get funding 5 to 10 million. And if you've got data, you're getting a log chain in your valuation. So poor data just gets nothing. In 21, even a vague idea or preclinical could get you funding. So it's a narrow set of companies that are getting funded. And that's a kind of short-term tactical problem, but the long-term opportunities in cell therapy, etc., we're yet to emerge.
Rebecca,
what happens with the companies that I'm involved in is that you look at what you have is a kind of a lengthening. So we'd be thinking about when we'd raise what rounds and what the financing strategy for that business would be, how far you need to get along a development path and that sort of thing, and what you would raise. Well, that would be a 10 million round, and that would be. And what you're seeing is both investors sort of saying they're going slower, some because they don't know when they will raise their next fund, so they are saying they will make investments slower. And also the companies so that selectivity comes in. So they'll be putting money into companies that have got more data and sort of pulling later. So the companies that are sitting here in a development path have to think about how to get further along that path before they raise the next amounts. And you kind of get just a sort of a lengthening process. Yeah. And in that process, some companies fall out of that because they can't attract the financing or give the evidence and the conviction to investors to back that process. So it's sort of a challenging time, but companies that have got really good technology and can come up with some flexibility in how they do that journey, the quality will survive this.
And one of the other knock-on effects of that is in the CRO space, which people think of. People sort of outside the industry think of life sciences as it's all about curing cancer and everything, but those companies often use the CROs, obviously, to undertake some of the work, the contract research organizations. And that wall of money that came through in 2021 funded an explosion in CRO activity, and that's going to wash through as well over the coming years. So that's not going to be quite as rosy, I don't think.
It used to be the case you could get a startup, if you just had about 15 months runway, you could just about get it funded. But now I think early stage investors will look for 2 years minimum and probably even more. So what you raise initially matters so much, and otherwise you've got to get ready for down rounds, etc. So I think what we're seeing is probably slightly better quality because those who are getting funding for 2.5, 3 years. And that's attracting more capital.
Does that change how companies are pitching themselves to investors when they're looking at a longer runway, when they're looking at different timescales?
They're certainly not looking at peer valuations, which they used to do in 21. So something was worth 50 million or whatever is probably now worth 10. So there's a reset in valuation. Because now I think it's all about enough capital to get you to a bridge to a milestone. And if you've got a milestone, you hope the data comes through and then you can raise some more money.
There's a lot of extension rounds going on, yes. and a lot of flat is the new up.
That's right. You, Rebecca, you were talking about how big that gap is between startup and scale up, and sometimes perhaps a lack of understanding among investee companies as to the length of journey that they could be on between those stages. Where does that most clearly manifest itself, and what are the options that companies have in terms of bridging that?
Well, I was actually also thinking that it's actually the external perception, because we get quite a lot of talk about seeding businesses and starting businesses, and there's lots of activity, and that's still very healthy. I feel that there's still the EIS scheme makes a huge difference. There's lots of angel investors and there's lots of seed finance. So it's still relatively easy to get that first money and get a company started. And then there's quite a lot of sort of policy activity and talk about financing the scale-up phase. And I feel like there's this sort of gap in perception where people don't realise that one doesn't lead to the other. Like they're kind of adjoining. Sometimes there's 5 or 10 years between that, and a huge amount of technology testing, validation, company building. It just programs of development, and that the concept of scale up seems a little fluid in people's minds. And scale up is you've got a business that's doing well and has de-risked, and now you want to grow, and it's all those de-risking steps. Whether it's does this drug work, does this technology perform in somebody else's lab, does this, whatever the test is, does this device do, does anybody care? That's the main de-risking step, isn't it, that we deal with every day. And just that journey can be very, very long. This is where we operate, is in that journey. And I kind of feel quite often people think that leads to that and forget that there's this whole, people talk about it being the valley of death at the moment, because there's a push to get money in to rightly. When we get a company there, we want there to be a way to grow it. Of course we do, but that sort of gets lost in the dialogue somewhere. That journey in between.
And unfortunately, in the UK, we need more Longwood capitals because there's a dearth of capital going into this space. So I do some angel investing, and EIS and SCIS are the best schemes in the world, actually. But of course, angels can only do up to 1 to 2 million. And then you have to go to external capital. So you have to try and get some US money if you can. But they're interested in 20, 30 million. So how are we going to fill that gap? And either you've got to go early or raise more and more smaller rounds. But that can take 5, 10 years.
But the point is that 20 or 30 gap comes with, you've validated this, you've validated that, you've validated the technology, you've validated the clinical performance, you've validated the market, you've got, whatever those things are, they'll put 20 or 30 million in once it's immediately going to grow a business. And the phase that we fund is the phase that isn't really growth, it's proving.
I mean, Syncona is a permanent capital fund, so it can do a small number of deals, which we can do 20, 30 million. But, it's a large fund, but there aren't many of those in Europe.
So by definition, you're looking at more smaller deals.
That's right. If you've got balance sheet capital, you can start something and put in 20, 30 million. Most funds are 10-year funds, so they've got a narrow window. But these balance sheet funds like Syncona or Sovereign Wealth Fund can afford to take a longer-term view and build a company. But unfortunately, there aren't many of those.
Glenn, where do you see the UK struggling to build businesses of scale in this space? And I know we've had conversations about comparing what's been achieved here to other markets, not least the US.
Well, I think there's a few things that are going on at the moment that are blockers to building companies of scale. Things like MHRA, where it used to take 4 to 6 weeks to get a turnaround, now it takes 4 to 6 months, which isn't the fault of the people in the MHRA. There just aren't enough of them, and there's an overwhelming flow of work. So we're seeing that really affect some of the companies that we've invested in, trying to move things along and then unable to do so because they're just waiting on the MHRA. So that's a real challenge, I think, that we need to keep pressing on. I know the BAA are pressing on that to try and get that addressed. Then there's things like access to talent is another real challenge that you speak to probably anybody in the room. They'll say that getting the right people in is always challenging, and it's become worse since Brexit, because you used to be able to obviously get people easily across from anywhere in the EU. Now it takes 6 months plus to get a visa, which people aren't going to wait for. And so we're seeing companies that used to have maybe 30% of their staff from the rest of the EU down to about 10%, and then struggling to fill some of the other spaces. So that's another of the things. Then there's the VPAS scheme, which is deterring the voluntary scheme for branded medicines that go into the NHS, which is basically a tax on the pharma companies, which is driving away pharma investment at the moment. So there's a few things where I think we're shooting ourselves in the foot as a country that could be relatively easily fixed. It's not like there is a massive amount of money that necessarily needs to be shoved at the industry. It's fixing the things that are broken and need to be corrected in order for businesses to work and to flow.
We've got a couple of interesting real estate-focused questions here on Slido. Almost everyone putting through anonymous questions on Slido as well, which is interesting. One here. Any thoughts on how to assess and get comfortable with tenant covenants? How is that tackled at Pioneer?
So I think to get comfortable, you need to, in this industry, in the real estate side of things, you need to understand the businesses. So we have a lot of people in the Pioneer Group who are from life science background, PhDs, or been in the industry working in labs, can look at the companies, understand them. When we're investing in the companies as well, obviously there's a ton of due diligence that is done. But clearly, if you look at a standard covenant, most of the companies that occupy life science space have a terrible covenant, and their credit record will be not very good at all, credit rating. So you just have to get to understand the industry, understand this type of companies that you're dealing with, and then you can assess them. We look at the team, we look at how well they work together, we look at the technology, we look at the market, we look at their historic rate of growth, how much funding they've got, who the funders are, what the likelihood of getting more investment is, all of those different things that you have to pull together. So it's a lot more work than a standard business, but I think ultimately it's worthwhile, because if you get the right businesses, then they will grow rapidly.
And Hitesh, you and I were talking about supply and demand within lab space. One of our guests here asks, on the basis that companies might now be going for slower burn rates and therefore slower growth and expansion, is the perception of huge unmet lab space demand real, or is it a 2021 hangover?
I do think there's still a demand for lab space, but I think the demand is for scale-up lab space. So I think if you're a cell and gene therapy company, for example, you can do a small-scale project in Catapult, for example, get a 5-patient data. But really, if you want to go to commercial market, you need to be able to have 500,000, depending on how rare the condition is. And I think there's lacking space in those, what I call the kind of big, tailor-made gene therapy type facilities. So I know there's going to be lots of retrofitting in, say, Canary Wharf, but the stuff in Stevenage, that kind of stuff is probably quite hard to get. White City, of course, is always full. So there are, and we're in the early stages of cell and gene therapy. I think there's 3 or 4 approved globally. And we've got about 30 to be approved in the next 10 years, 5 to 10 years. This is from the FDA. So there is a pipeline of approvals coming, and they'll all need scale-up manufacturing. And cell and gene therapy labs are more complicated. So it's more about investing in that part of the market.
It's one of the bottlenecks, isn't it?
It's one of the bottlenecks.
The manufacturing and access to cell and gene therapy.
And you can't get yield either, so the yields are quite hard. So there's a lot of wastage. It's not like semiconductors, where you can build at 95, 97, 99% efficiency. And we're early in the cycle, right?
It is, but the challenge is that those sort of facilities are really difficult for real estate developers to back, because that's when the covenants do become more challenging, because you don't know if you're in the scale-up phase and you haven't got a product that's actually on market yet. You still don't know whether it's going to make it, and then you're investing in all that facility and infrastructure, which is why I think it'll end up being focused in a few key areas where others will step in, like Stevenage and elsewhere, where others will be able to step into the place if it's vacated.
I came across a really remarkable stat, at least it was to me. There's 6 therapies, I think, now approved, cell therapies, so CAR T therapies, and the estimate that only 16,000 patients have had it worldwide. Yeah. All of those, and so there's a massive thing that's got to happen.
Priced at $3 to $4 million, but curative, right? We're entering a phase we call the third wave in pharma, where we've never really had curative treatments. And so that changes also the dynamics of pharma companies.
Rebecca, you spoke at the beginning about the regularity with which you're speaking to chief executives and other leaders in the businesses that you're backing, and I think you mentioned sort of weekly or more than weekly calls. What does a supportive investor bring to a young and growing business? Clearly, there's the money, but in terms of that mentoring ability, that picking up the phone, giving advice in tougher markets like we're seeing at the moment. What is your role in supporting growth beyond, as I say, simply the cold hard cash?
So I'm somewhat sceptical about investors that say they bring lots of value add. You have to look under the hood as to what that is, because people who talk about black books and all the rest of it and contacts and things like that, by definition, we're investing in so many different companies. And if we once were in a sector, we haven't been there for a long time. So those sort of networks are very fragile. They come and go very quickly. But what I think the value add really is just the experience of having done that journey with so many companies and so many different companies. And we the Longwall team sit together every Monday morning and talk about every single company that we're working with and what the problems they're having, the challenges they're having, and just bringing that perspective and experience, and quite often just some reassurance that every other company's done this before. A lot of the time we're backing first-time CEOs, especially in really early-stage companies. They've often got a kind of a postdoc coming out of a university that's championed them. We try to pick the stars that we really think can become business leaders, and there's a huge learning curve journey that those individuals go on. I mean, massive learning curve journey, especially in the first few years. And we can just help them because we've done that journey with others mostly. It's very important to me. I think people have to be very wary about the nature of that relationship. Actually, it's incredibly important to me that it's a positive, enabling relationship. You get a lot of you can get into a relationship where the investors are kind of police, picking up, looking for things that are going wrong and kind of catching stuff out that's been done wrong, and that is just not the right way to build an ambitious business, to be constantly policing and holding back. It's an interpersonal relationship of positivity, mentorship, and culture. And some of us have been operators before, some of us haven't. Sometimes operators can't turn into investors because they don't know how to stop operating. But others, that's what we're really bringing, is that positive facilitation and enablement, and you have to watch quite carefully that you're empowering people to be their best rather than catching them out when they're not on their best. And that's something to be careful of. But mostly I think it is just, we've just done it with so many companies, and we've seen it. We've seen this problem here, we've seen that problem there. We can tell them who they can talk to about that. So they can talk to that about somebody else. And that's the real kind of value add, I suspect. So.
And the other skill on that is actually identifying the manager for that stage of the company. And sometimes the hard decision is to move them on. So you might have a Series A CEO, but they're not going to make it to IPO, for example. Mm-hmm. And I think the skill which investors bring is actually making them the right choice in each stage of the company's growth.
At the end of the day, once you've taken investment from a fund like ours or from Synconia's, you've kind of all agreed on an ambition. Yeah. So I have quite a lot of quite frank conversations with early teams about what they want to do with the business and where they want to get to, because we frankly sort of restrict their options, really, because we have return ambitions that we need for each of our investments, and that's the journey. And then our role partly becomes staying true to that ambition. And that's it. So I talk to founding CEOs about, I kind of want them to think like shareholders if they're shareholders. What's the best for their business, and to bring that perspective to it.
Yeah. Do we have any questions from the floor? There are still plenty more to work through from Slido, but would anyone like to get a roving mic to them? It feels a shame that we've invested in the roving microphones and have managed to use them so little. Would anyone like to put a question to the panel? In which case?
There's one over there.
Oh, is there one?
I can see.
It looks so dark out there, I could barely make it out.
Yeah, definitely saw a hand.
Hi, I've put it on Slido as well, so you don't have to ask it now. Sarah Hayward from Advanced Oxford. I think one of the things that is a weakness in the UK investment environment is being able to achieve much, much larger and more significant levels of investment, which for life sciences are incredibly important, particularly as you move into the clinic. Given that IPOs are difficult because they're either in favour or out of favour, one of the solutions is to try and attract more institutional investment into venture. And I'm interested to hear what the panel think about ways that we could encourage investment from pension funds, insurance, etc. So both encouraging, and what does government need to do to facilitate that?
I can take that. So I think the pension fund idea is kind of modelled on Australia, Canada, Australia in particular, where part of the pension fund is allocated to venture. And the UK has been talking about it for many years. I was Downing Street 10 years ago talking about the same thing under David Cameron's, and we're still waiting for it. And part of the problem is the operating model of pension funds and the independence of trustees. So this is expensive. The high risk in venture means, say, out of 10 investments, 8 will go to zero. Therefore, you need charge a higher fee. And that's one of the challenges why the pension fund industry we haven't squared that circle, how you can charge a higher fee for things that could go to zero to make up for the investment you've made. I know there's also talk about it, but in theory, we should take that capital, and either it can be mandated, which is I think what Labour are talking about. But I think when you've got a legal obligation on pension trustees to look after their pensioners, I think it gets very difficult to do that. So I can't see an easy way where you can either encourage them to do it, or you need a carve-out fund in a pension in a big pension fund, and say that this is for the UK PLC, and therefore it's a less commercial operation. But you need all the pension funds to do that.
I mean, good portfolio strategy suggests that a small proportion of any portfolio should be in the high-risk end, doesn't it? And that's what the leading Performance of Ontario Teachers Fund, always the ones that are cited as great examples of funds that are better that have spread a risk and have outperformed the ones that are taking less risk and not paying fees. But the part of the challenge is sort of sitting where I am in that kind of middle zone. We've got some defined contribution schemes in our fund. It's going to get harder to get those in future because they've gone into pooling schemes, which means that they're aggregated into larger pots, which means that making an investment into our size of fund, which is an appropriate size of fund for that early growing business investing that we do, they're just not interested in the allocation. It's just like peanuts. It's just peanuts for them. They're just not interested in making it, and that's getting worse rather than getting better, actually. And so it's some what's missing. Even if you persuade people that taking the risk is what they should be doing in their portfolio strategy, and the regulations change to allow that to happen, what I'm nervous about is the middle layer won't be there that allows these very large funds to put allocations into, our funds are 7,500, that sort of early stage VC funds are typically that size in this country, and that's a sensible size for allocating to 10 to 20 companies, 5 to 10 million per company. That's still, when they're just starting out, that's a good size in this market. But with this, there's no way. It's just this big divide that needs to be bridged. And
there's the British Business Bank, for example, who do obviously back early stage venture, and they've got capital to allocate, but again, they won't often lead, so there's some kind of discussion there. But if I can give one success story, Northern Gritstone, which is a fund out of Northern Universities, I think that's got pension fund investment. So I think there's kind of pockets of success. And the Midlands Mindforge group are trying to do the same thing. So there is some small progress, but at the end of the day, I think it's about fund management of operating margins, if I can say that, because
it's completely different in the US, isn't it? I mean, the level of participation in equity in the economy is just on a whole nother level.
And there's
So I guess the question is, what is happening in Australia, Canada, and the US that isn't happening
mandated.
here?
It's mandated.
Right.
So super fund in Australia, it's always been encouraged, and I think there's an element of fees either subsidised by somebody along the line, and Australia actually, in terms of innovation, is actually overcapitalised because there aren't enough tech companies to put money in. So a lot of Australian money is actually coming to the UK, I've noticed.
Right.
But the huge pools of capital, right, in Canada is the same.
But that
If we did, I think
we're looking for an
UK.
answer.
Yeah, well, that's politicians have to do that then.
Yeah.
And then there's been talk about it, but I think it's this trustee angle as well, because trustees obviously have a legal obligation.
Thank you, Sarah. We're just running up on time now, but I wanted to throw one more Slido question at you each for maybe just a quick answer. Our guest says there's ever-increasing competition for funds at the moment, and everyone is claiming that they have something truly innovative. How do you choose which companies to invest in? And I know that's a big question, but I wonder if you could each give us one box that absolutely has to be ticked when you're deciding whether to support a particular venture.
Oh, it's the black art.
I think market opportunity, the concept of total addressable market, is really, really important to understand that you can start something, and if at the end of you do the calculation and you think it's a $200 million market, you're not really going to get your return. So if I'm, as an angel investor, typically I want 10x my money if I'm putting in that risk capital. In a portfolio of 10, 8 will go. As you go up the scale, you de-risk it, your return expectations go down to kind of 3 times, for example. Pre-IPO might be 2 times. So you're doing such high-risk stuff in the early stage. You probably want to put more bets than you would normally do if you want to kind of minimize your risk. And in the early stage, actually, you're picking people, really.
You said 2. That's not fair.
I'm going to do a nuance on that because it's the thing that's changed the most in the 15 years that I've been investing in startup companies, and it's the building for that market. Whereas, especially with science and technology developments, you get a lot of what you call tech push, which is great tech that people think, oh, we can commercialize this, and it gets sort of pushed out, and it's basically looking for an application. And what's really changed is some of the accelerator programs like BioCity and now Pioneer Group were leaders in putting out, which is now that Innovate UK are funding IQ programs, things that actually teach people how to go out and find out if they've got a commercial opportunity. I remember hearing an entrepreneur speak at a business school event, so it's a very general audience. And he was a serial entrepreneur that started, I think, lots of media businesses, so it's a completely different kind of world. But he talked about how he was very aware of his opportunity cost. And he didn't start a business until he'd validated that there was some market for it, that there was somebody that wanted it. No matter how much you calculate the hope of that market, he wanted to know. And he put an ad in the back of the newspaper that said, that basically was for the product he was going to build a business around. And when checks came through the door, he decided he'd got a market. And people in the audience were like, well, what did you do with those checks? Because you hadn't even started the business. He said, well, I sent them back and said I'd be in touch when I got a product. But he found out that he'd got a market before he started the business. And that just wasn't happening 15 years ago in science, UK science companies. People were building stuff and you'd say, well, have you spoken to anybody that might use this? And they say, oh, no, we haven't built it yet. And I definitely had conversations like that. So that's really changed, and I think that's what I'm instinctively always looking for is, well, does anybody care? Does anybody want this? And are they going to pay for it? Is the sort of the question. But you can't ignore the fact it's got to be a good technology with some patents and super people and all the rest of the normal things.
We throw darts at a dartboard. see which one.
Trade secret.
No, one of the advantages of having the venture building side and the companies that are based on our sites is that we get to know the founders and the people that are running the companies really well over a period of sometimes a couple of years. And actually, that will be our one thing. It's the people, ultimately. You can have a great business that is cocked up by somebody who just will not work with other people, will not listen, and then you can have something that is not quite so good, but you've got a dynamic entrepreneurial team who will just work over any obstacle and will make it work. So I think that would be number one for us. It's the people.
It's the talent. All right, excellent. Well, look, thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you for the questions as well, and please put your hands together for the panel.